views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Social Justice Forums. I'm Daren, Jaime. And for those people who ask the question, what are the Social Justice Forums about? Well, it's an opportunity to talk about some of the inequities that many people face. We promote civic engagement, and then we have constructive dialogue around many of these matters. So we encourage you. We got a great show. Stay with us. The Social Justice Forums begins right now. And welcome back. The Blueprint for Change transition plan aims to privatize scores of public housing residents, which will permanently eliminate thousands of affordable housing units in NYC, as well as put over 100,000 working class Black, Indigenous, and other people of color at risk of homelessness. The Blueprint for Change was introduced in July 2020, just following the first wave of a pandemic, which was twice as fatal for NYCHA residents as the city overall. Joining us now to discuss more is the founder of Ojala Threads and NYCHA Tenant, Ramona Ferreyra. And then we've also got founder of the Bronx Institute for Urban Systems, Cesar, and Justice for All Coalition member, Kristen, Hackett. And thank you all for joining us for a much needed conversation at a time like this. Thank you, guys. I'll start off first by going to you first, Ramona, to share with us a little bit about where we are and your concerns, particularly as it pertains to NYCHA.
So the last time that we had appeared on the show, we were discussing the danger that is the blueprint legislation. And we're really interested in updating New Yorkers and those that are supportive of public housing throughout the city on what's happened with the blueprint legislation and also the campaign that we began to kill the bill. It's what it's called. So the state tried to introduce the legislation back in December. And it was clear that advocates and tenants did not support it. They tried again right before this legislative session ended, giving us about a week and a half to organize and really, counter the blueprint. And once again, we were able to convince the legislature, the state legislature, that it is not a plan that NYCHA tenants or advocates or those with a legal background support. Unfortunately, the state legislature leads have made it clear that they will continue to try to introduce the blueprint. And we anticipate that they're going to do this again when the legislative calendar opens up. So because of that, we're spending our summer doing teach-ins and supporting family days, which are, traditional Block parties that happen at every NYCHA development. At these, we are educating tenants on what the blueprint is, because only a small percentage has actually heard of the plan. When the president of NYCHA was holding forums on it, only about 2,500 people participated. And we have a community that is 400,000 at this point, which means that there's a huge need for outreach and education. So we are trying to fill that gap, which NYCHA is not serving. And we are also calling for the immediate removal of the president of NYCHA, Greg Russ. As you mentioned in the intro, NYCHA tenants were affected and died from COVID at twice the rate of other New Yorkers. And one of the key reasons that has come to, be exposed is that at the beginning of the pandemic, NYCHA was warned that if they didn't change our filter system, our actual exhaust vents, that there would be more COVID infections amongst NYCHA tenants and ultimately more deaths. Instead of focusing on, critical and urgent matters such as this, the current NYCHA president has dedicated his time and significant assets, as far as we can see, at least $200,000 on trying to convince tenants of the blueprint legislation and telling tenants that the blueprint legislation is the answer. And we have had it with having conversations with him. And at this point, we're calling for his immediate removal.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. I want to cover a couple of topics first before we get there. And I'll bring Cesar in to talk a little bit about the Green New Deal for public housing, because when we talk about public housing and green does not always go hand in hand. Talk to us about the Green New Deal for public housing.
First, I wanted to talk a little bit about what Nycha is doing. So, and then I could talk about the Green New Deal for public housing. They're connected to each other. Nycha, around 2017, it started the sustainability agenda. So now they have a new recent report in 2020 about the sustainability agenda. So in there, it has about energy and carbon, health and well-being. And then the sustainability goal number 5 is economics. So they talk about the trust and then pact. So in that report, it seems like they're trying to get funds from those initiatives, to fulfill the sustainability agenda. So then as to the Green New Deal for public housing is to see public housing in a different way. The Green New Deal for public housing is not only Nycha, is public housing throughout the whole United States. So AOC introduced it. Me and other people from Movement School, we worked together to put together this bill. I included some things there in the bill, and then it was introduced around, I think around June of last year, to retrofit housing, use energy initiatives. Housing consumes a lot of energy. A lot of energy is lost through the way the buildings are constructed. So the Green New Deal tries to focus on that, and also to have more ways of tenants to be able to participate in greening public housing. So Green New Deal for public housing does that. But for us, it's also trying to find another mechanism that, regardless of where the funds come from, Nycha should go to a new age of sustainability, because a lot of the funny thing I would say regarding that is that a lot of these buildings are near the waterfront. And when Sandy hits, some of these areas were devastated by Sandy. So with climate change, and this might happen a little bit more, as you notice, there have been more rainy days in this summer. So that's gonna happen a little bit more. So that's a little bit about the Green New Deal for public housing.
Yeah, and we know that the deal was also introduced in 2019. Talk to us about where it stands right now.
So right now is being pushed nationally. Before, when I was helping, it was more focused in Nycha per se, more in the city. But then Sunrise Movement, it started pushing it more at a national level in order to pass this legislation. So like I said, it was introduced by AOC. It's still out there. It's not yet in committee to be go for voting, but it's still a great push, like I said, nationally to.
Yeah. Let me bring Kristen in and talk a little bit about rental assistance, and you can speak to us a little bit more about the rental assistance demonstration.
Okay, so rental assistance demonstration is a national policy that was developed under Obama in 2012 and is now privatizing public housing across the country. There's a larger context here. So since the 70s and 80s, when Section 8 was actually created, the national housing policy direction has been towards subsidizing private investment in housing, which is really different than what we see with public housing, which is direct investment, public investment in housing. And so this has increasingly put public housing on the chopping block, where at the national level, increasingly congressional representatives, many of whom have ties to real estate developers or affordable housing industry leaders, have increasingly been calling for the privatization of public housing. And we saw Hope 6 in the 90s, which decimated public housing in Cincinnati, in Chicago, and in St. Louis. Cabrini Green, the explosion of Cabrini Green is perhaps like something that sticks in people's memories. And then we see that didn't apply to Nycha at the time, because buildings in Nycha in New York City, public housing, were not in the disrepair that they're in today. So they actually didn't qualify for Hope 6 at the time. So RAD was a kind of a subsequent privatization plan that emerged in 2012 under Obama, and is a national program that now has privatized I want to say more than 200,000 units nationally. They could privatize as many as 500,000 right now, because there is a cap limiting the number of units that they can privatize nationally. But the way that these privatize the buildings is that they bring in private managers to manage the properties. In some cases, public housing authorities are actually selling off their entire public housing portfolios to private developers and managers. In New York City, we see the city is maintaining a stake in the properties. It varies by deal. So at Ocean Bay, I think they have a 51% stake in the property, but that can be different at different developments that are being converted. But then they lease the property to private developers for 99 years, which is greater than most lifetimes. Right. So from a human perspective, this is privatization, even though the city is maintaining that leasehold interest. But then the everyday management responsibilities are being transferred to private developers and managers, and construction is also being outsourced to those companies. And when we look at the long list of companies that are being selected, we see that these are some of the most egregious private managers in the country, in the city, with histories of eviction and tenant harassment. So a lot of emphasis has been placed on Wavecrest because they are well known for high rates of eviction and tenant harassment, especially after they took over a lot of rents stabilized buildings about 10 years ago. But that's their emblem. They're not an exception, right? They're emblematic of the private partners that the city is involving in these deals. C+C Management is another egregious actor operating in the realm of affordable housing in New York City, who is now moving into public housing through the RAD program, who has, again, histories of eviction and tenant harassment and being a slumlord and things like that. So that's what RAD is.
Yeah. I want to bring Ramona in and talk a little bit about where we are today, because obviously with COVID has further exacerbated some things as far as NYCHA tenants are concerned. Give us an update as to what you can tell us about the state of NYCHA and the way things are going, particularly in COVID, because I've talked to several people who say, you know, COVID has already hard hit the area, but when it comes to NYCHA, it just seems like to have in some ways decimated some places.
Yeah, so things have been, there hasn't really been much improvement in NYCHA. When we had the first big wave of COVID in New York City, NYCHA really failed to properly sanitize, clean, and protect tenants. And that trend has continued. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we were all told that NYCHA would have to take measures to keep staff and residents safe. And that led to any repairs being canceled. Now, NYCHA has not reversed this policy yet. So what's happened is that for the last year and couple months, folks have been waiting on much needed repairs and not getting those. Now, we believe that the reason that NYCHA has not revamped, you know, their work schedule and is not providing sufficient staff to get things done is because a key component of the blueprint is that HUD has to find our apartments obsolete. So finding them obsolete means that the apartment in itself is a danger to those that live there. And more importantly, it requires a tenant protection voucher be issued from HUD. And that tenant protection voucher is, you know, building on what Kristen just explained, is what actually pays the actual management company to take care of the unit and bring it up to code. So we actually feel that it's been a strategic decision on the part of Greg Russ to not complete repairs and to not support properties and to really be the last to respond. You know, you'll remember last year, folks were doing food drives, doing, you know, community refrigerators, getting face masks. We saw tenant association presidents taking on the lead roles in, you know, really complicated situations and putting themselves at risk at a time where NYCHA was not providing any support. You know, even with the recent family days, NYCHA put out rules requiring certain COVID measures, demanding additional paperwork, basically complicating the process for tenant association presidents, but not providing any support. And when we've asked, I asked, directly of Janelle Hudson over email for support so that tenants would get, more information from the Department of Health, Board of Elections and other city agencies at family days. We never got an answer back from Janelle Hudson, right? So this is someone that's supposed to be leading resident engagement. And as we recover from this pandemic, we are not seeing resident engagement or NYCHA really step forward. So things have not improved for residents, but surprisingly so when they understand what the blueprint does, which is really privatize our homes and then allow private investors to play with the values of our homes. Nobody wants that. Folks are willing to not get a new refrigerator and new stove, which is what NYCHA loves to give people as a promise, and hold on to what is Section 9 housing, right? So Section 9 housing is public housing as defined by Congress. And NYCHA does not understand that we do not accept any plans that remove us from Section 9. So things, they really haven't improved. I would say the one thing that has gotten better is tenant involvement, engagement in education, groups like Safe Section 9, the coalition that we're in, which includes Justice for All. It includes CAV, Organizing for Asian Americans, and other organizations. We're doing the work repeatedly and daily that NYCHA should be doing, but they're not.
So, Cesar, I'll bring you back in to talk a little bit more. When we talk about really NYCHA doing the work, this Green Deal really helps and assists NYCHA in getting the ball across the finish line in a whole lot better way. What can you tell us when it comes to really that public participation and really, because you're talking about it hasn't made it to committee yet, but how has it been going in terms of getting the word out and getting people to really urge these electeds to get behind the Green New Deal, to accept some responsibility and to really put things forthright for the people of NYCHA?
The Green New Deal for public housing is a push, like I said, it's a national level. I haven't been actually involved that much recently. In any form, whatever the funds come from, is to use a lot of these, principles and goals of the Green New Deal for public housing to be implemented, regardless of where the funds come from. So I could just say, and then as to tenants, it's not a lot of science education here in public housing. So when you talk about climate change, most people do recognize environmental justice because I'm from the South Bronx, so people do see that. And then for me, it's a push for me to increase education through community gardening. So I have a garden here called Midbury Gardens, and we use this garden in order to educate people about sustainable, why it's important to be green. Well, then NYCHA doesn't have this thing that they educate people about like energy behaviors. A lot of people use air conditioners, especially when we have heat waves, but it's not their fault. It's more like you are basically had to do this because you're in a heat wave. So it's just a lack of education about these things. Right now, through Green New Deal for public housing, it's just one way, but there are other bills out there, that could be being introduced that could also need these initiatives or this agenda, this goals to green NYCHA. So I can't fully answer that question. All I know is that there's a lot of education needed.
Yeah, a lot of education is needed. And when we talk about really getting the word out, I think that's going to be key for a lot of residents and also the community, because the community isn't so much, while we do know there are problems in NYCHA, I think the overarching is that sometimes the general public is not aware as to a lot of the things that go on in terms of NYCHA and public housing. Some is due to ignorance and some is due just to the fact that, people have other concerns, but that's for the purpose of us, really getting together and having this conversation today to really make people aware as to what needs to be done and what can be done to really improve the state of Nycha. And Kristen, if you can share with us a little bit, there's the acronym PACT, and I know that stands for the Permanent Affordability Commitment Together. And what can you tell us about PACT and its effects?
I want to go back to one thing you just mentioned, though, that like Cesar was also talking about this, like how and why people don't understand, right? Because actually it's really important towards what Ramona was saying, that Greg Russ and Nycha have put a tremendous amount of energy and resources towards misinforming residents about what these plans are, right? So since like January, or even really since last year, Greg Russ has engaged a serious political public relations strategy where he's repeating that the public trust and the blueprint are this public to public transfer, and really not even discussing at all the alternatives like the Green New Deal for public housing. And there's been a real sort of just disregard for what's going on in RAD packed buildings, or buildings that were converted through RAD, just like ignoring the terror that tenants are dealing with in those buildings. And so the misinformation isn't just like about what people on the ground are doing or can doing. It's also that we're coming up against this real challenge where Greg Russ and Nycha are intentionally creating misinformation. And we hosted a truth commission on RADPAC to like allow residents to give testimonies about the experience living in buildings that had been converted, because so far HUD and Nycha and the city and elected officials have not done that inquiry. And as we were preparing for that event and moving forward with it, some groups started doing rent strikes or organizing more extensively. And Nycha and the mayor put out a statement that called organizing groups and residents, the work that they were doing was misinformation, right? And so there's not only them putting out misinformation, but they're also intentionally trying to delegitimize efforts that are trying to inform residents. I think that's important to understand for this context. And to your other question about what is PACT, so PACT is really just the version of RAD in New York City. So Rental Assistance Demonstration, or RAD, is the federal program that was designed by HUD. PACT is New York City's version or brand of RAD that we're implementing here. And how it differs a little bit is that across the country, RAD is converting buildings to Section 8 and usually using different kinds of subsidies in addition to the Section 8 funding, like low-income housing tax credits. In New York City, though they're not eligible for those tax credits, but what they're using in PACT is Section 18 to convert buildings to Section 8. And Section 18 allows developers and private partners to get more valuable federal subsidies. So instead of just Section 8. So it's these tenant protection vouchers that are being used in the blueprint, which are also being used in a lot of the RAD deals in New York City, which increase the amount of public money that the developer can get by unit. And that's packaged into RAD, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I'll add on what Kristen just mentioned was the lack of accountability that we see when it comes to RAD and PACT, and how it's demonstrated itself with these slumlords. It has been years since HUD actually did a survey to measure the impact that RAD and PACT is having on public housing across the country, right? So one of the things I like to point out to folks is that until recently, Nycha would say, we have 600,000 folks living in public housing. And starting in the summer, they started changing that number to 400,000. And the reason they're doing that is because they eliminated 200,000 units, right? 200,000 people are no longer considered living in public housing. And when those people try to go to Nycha for support with repairs, we've seen chronic issues and capital expenses that are not being addressed. Even here in the South Bronx at Betances, which is a development that decided to go with RAD. At first, they were very happy, right? And everything was getting cleaned, and everyone got a new stove, and everybody got a fridge, and they had ice, and that was great. And then their pipes started bursting again. And Nycha turned around and said, well, that's not our problem, because you're no longer part of Nycha. And then their management company, Kristen, it's Wavecrest, right? Wavecrest turned around and said, we can't handle your pipes because we don't own the building. We're just leasing it, right?
Mm.
So they don't like to talk about those issues. And the True Forum that Kristen held with Justice for All was recorded, and it's out there for people to watch and to really gain an understanding of why we don't want folks to be saying no to conversions. You know, a lot of the work that we do, Cesar and I as tenants, we see retaliation. You know, I've gotten eviction notices twice for the stuff that I'm doing. Some tenant association presidents are harassed for the work that we're doing. And it is our federally guaranteed right that we can organize, educate, and participate in the management of our buildings per Section 9 coding, right? So when we look at, you know, folks and we tell them don't go for private, we always get that question of, well, then how do we fix it?
Mhm.
And, you know, I think what Cesar was highlighting is that the Green New Deal is just one, you know, set of values and principles. I like to tell folks the Green New Deal is like a religion. You know, you either want to take your bread every Sunday or you just want to go to mass. Either way, Nycha needs to be creating a resilient public housing stock that's going to last the next 100 years. And with the money that Chuck Schumer is trying to secure for public housing nationally, with the rights that we see Maxine Wright trying to protect for Nycha and public housing across the country, there are other options, you know, and to us, it's really interesting that in addition to making things dangerous for us, in addition to neglecting our homes for the last year and a half, the minute that Chuck Schumer and other Congress people started talking about funding, Nycha refused to go out there with them. So every time you see Chuck Schumer at a development talking to tenants, talking to elected officials, and everyone wants to defend public housing, Nycha's absent. And that's because to them, even if Chuck Schumer's money comes through, they still want to pursue privatization. And to us, that's a no-go. So if this leadership at Nycha right now is, you know, refusing to deviate from their plan, that leadership doesn't belong there, because we know we have options and that we have a right to be listened when we're talking about options, and that we have a right to be a part of the decision-making process when that option is chosen.
Right. Kristen, about the option, I mean, you know, we talk about these various options and wanting to have a say in the process. How effective do you feel like your voice is in terms of being heard by many out there when it comes to the issues?
Yeah, I think in terms of being heard, I think that there's a real silencing that's happening, in part because of Greg Russ's media blitz. And he has basically wrangled a number of nonprofits and media outlets to publish in support of the blueprint, even though I think fundamentally a lot of these folks, some of these folks don't really understand what the blueprint really is and why it's different. And they also do not live in these buildings. So I actually think there's a lot of noise being made by outsiders and people who are being brought in with expertise to advocate for the blueprint in a way that is silencing residents and the opposition that's happening. But we have held at least actions this year, which did get picked up by the media. And I think that the movement is growing not only citywide and getting more folks involved through the work that the Save Section 9 campaign is doing and taking on this summer, but also we're trying to grow more nationally, because we also understand that the fight for public housing can't just be waged here in New York City or won based on the perspectives of elected officials here, right? We really need national consensus. And I think my particular interest in the writing work that I'm doing is about positioning the fight for public housing vis-a-vis the larger housing crisis, right? The loss of public housing in New York City would intensify gentrification in a number of these communities, because the way that they're actually going about repairing the buildings is by repairing the outside of the building so that you can't tell this is what a lot of them, you can't even tell public housing is here, which means that property values for private developers surrounding those developments also goes up. and rents go up. So when people start getting displaced, they don't get displaced to their neighborhoods or even to New York City, right? They're now going into shelters, and shelters are another business plan in New York City, right? And in some cases, what we start to see when we start to look at who is making these decisions or politically advocating for the privatization of public housing is that they're all affordable housing industry leaders who make money off of high rents in private market, who make money off of rent stabilized buildings and jacking those rents up, who are making money off of the homelessness crisis here in New York City, right? And the Save Section 9 campaign isn't really just about preserving public housing as it exists. It's actually arguing, I think, that public housing is the answer to the crisis that we're seeing, right? Since the 70s, as we've seen this trend towards subsidizing private investment in affordable housing, we're actually seeing that the levels of affordable housing are becoming shallower and shallower, and that the numbers of the affordable units are less and less, right? And so this is a bad direction in general for housing policy in the country. And that if we want to try to actually resolve the housing crisis, we need to do more direct public investment in housing, which is Section 9 is the only instance of direct public investment in housing in this country. So the Save Section 9 campaign is about preserving public housing and potentially getting to a place where we're talking about expanding that to house people who are currently unhoused or precariously housed, or might be losing their homes now due to this eviction crisis because of the pandemic. I know I answered the question. But.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, I only have 1 minute left, so Cesar, I'm gonna let you get the last minute. Go ahead.
Yes, one thing that you notice is a Save Section 9. We're talking about Section 9 public housing everywhere throughout the United States. BIPOC communities are the first to be affected by climate change, right? Everybody knows that that's the truth. So we're here to protect public housing outside of New York City as well, because they also face the same things that we do. And then a lot of these things are very cosmetic changes. They use sustainability, and then it has some vagueness to it. If you want to be sustainable, you have to retrofit this building and make it sustainable that it lasts 100 years, not that it lasts 10 and 20 years, and then you got to spend a couple of more billions of dollars to update it again. So this is a push as well to redo it. So this is a push to be sustainable, and for people to be the leaders in sustainability in green infrastructure and green architecture. And why not us? Because you could also be part of the solutions for climate change. That's the way I see it.
Well, thank you all. I mean, obviously a conversation we need to continue to follow when it comes to NYCHA and the work going forward. And I know that we've had you on before. We'll definitely have you on again so we can continue to update the public, and best wishes and definitely raising your voice and creating an awareness, and glad that you could share it on this platform with us here at the Social Justice Forums.
Thank you so much for having us. I mean, it's great to be able to continue the conversation. And, our petition is currently at about 3,500 signatures. And we're so proud of that because we've actually talked to 3,500 people in public housing. And we're going to continue to keep that work and come back and keep updating you. All
right. Well, make sure you do. And thank you all for joining us. All right. We are going to take a quick break here on the Social Justice Forums. We encourage you to stay with us. We'll be back with another guest right after this.
We know that people are dealing with the health crisis, but there's also a lot of food insecurity.
We're giving out healthy food options, and that's what's key here.
If you're a senior, you have a disability, they'll actually deliver meals to you.
The residents are anxious, they're worried, they're scared, they want to be tested.
When things were happening in our community, and we couldn't get the help.
There's almost a presumption of criminality that attaches to your skin color.
The site will prioritize those who are at highest risk in the population.
If you feel symptoms and you'd like to visit one of these COVID-19 testing sites here in the Bronx, you may call the State Health Department's hotline.
Important to note about this site is no reservations are needed. This is a walk-in clinic.
A lot of us are out of work and looking for something to do.
We have the machinery and the skills to make large scales of these masks and gowns.
Take care of your people. It's going to go way further than we actually can understand.
Right now, employees like myself are just adjusting to the new reality.
Reporting from BronxNet, this is Trans.
When taking public transportation, don't touch your phone. Carry hand sanitizer and use it immediately upon leaving the bus or train. Avoid touching your face. If someone is coughing or sneezing, move away. Wash your hands with soap and water as soon as possible. Limit contact with poles. If possible, avoid rush hour. Don't eat or drink on public transportation. Keep your bag off the floor or other surfaces. Avoid directly touching turnstiles. Stay up to date with the latest from your local health department and CDC.
and welcome back to the show. 35,000 people are on parole in New York City, and they are all daily subjects to reincarceration for technical violations. African Americans are reincarcerated for technical parole violations 12 times the rate as their white counterparts. And African Americans statewide are 5 times more likely to receive a technical parole violation. Now, the Less is More Coalition is urging Governor Andrew Cuomo to sign the Less is More Act immediately to bring transformative parole reform to New York. Joining us to share is the Katal Center for Equity, Health, and Justice's member, Avion Gordon. And Avion, good to have you.
Good to be here.
Good to have you for this conversation. And I guess when we talk about this here, and we look at, as I said in the intro, there's a disparity when it comes to these technicalities and these violations, particularly for those in communities of color. When we look at what we see is by way of reform, and we look at what these parole actually doing, talk to us a little bit about what this means to you by way of how these parole violations really impact people's lives.
So in my case, I'm on parole. I've been on parole for about a year, almost coming up on 1 year anniversary mark. And parole can be very destructive to people and their families, right? It can be destructive because we are under these curfews. We're under this constant fear that we can be reincarcerated for something as small as a technical parole violation, something as small as a missing an appointment with your parole officer, something as small as missing, testing positive for alcohol or any type of substance. So people on parole live under the umbrella or blanket of this ongoing fear that, hey, you could do something small as knowing someone else on parole or knowing someone else with a criminal history and be reincarcerated for that. So it's very fearful.
Yeah. And so we're talking about the Less is More Act, right? And so when we talk about this legislation and reform, talk to us about what you want to see happen.
So I would like to see, so the legislator passed this bill in the last session, June 10th. And I would like to see Governor Cuomo sign this bill immediately, but not only immediately, I would like him to implement it immediately or put it in effect earlier than the March 2022 date. But that's what I would like to see.
Yeah. And when we look at this here right now, and we look at how parole is really impacting the lives of so many people, give us your experience, because you touched upon something a little bit earlier when you said, when you're on parole, here you are and you're walking around with this fear. And do you walk around with that kind of fear on a daily basis?
I do work around with this fear on a daily basis. So a little bit about myself. My name is Adrian Gordon. I was wrongfully incarcerated in 2018. That case has been dismissed in the interest of justice. And currently I have 1983 civil action lawsuit against my county. So I live under this constant fear because I reside in the county that I am on parole. And things as small as things as small as driving was an issue, or being around certain people is the issue, because technically anything can happen. We know that people of color are more likely to be stopped by police officers. We know that people of color may be racially profiled. So yeah, it's a constant fear, something that I feel like I have to walk on eggshells or tread lightly around, because anything could happen and I could be reincarcerated, and not only reincarcerated, I could spend a long time in prison because of this.
Right. And so for you, as you said, you had your, you pretty much are at the place right now where you're on parole, and that has gone away. But talk to us about the criminal justice system, because going through the system, being a part of going through that system, give us from an inside perspective to an outsider, what is that really like, particularly when you look there and you find predominantly people of color?
Yeah, so I could tell you a story about someone who I known in the past that was reincarcerated for a technical parole violation, because that's what Less is More is about. Less is More is about technical parole violations. I was incarcerated when I met my first example of a person incarcerated for a technical parole violation, and he spent months in jail only to find out that he wasn't supposed to be there. So this man lost his job, his family, his housing, everything was disrupted. And then it was later deemed to be he was there. He wasn't even supposed to be there. It was a mistake or a administrative misjudgment on behalf of the parole officer. And I like to tell the story because this individual is actually incarcerated for having a sheetrock knife, a knife intended for use at his job. His life was turned upside down because of something he needed to make a living. So it's just crazy what we have to face on a constant daily basis with this.
Right. And so the reform is important and really getting the word out. Do you feel as though a lot of the public knows about this and the need for this kind of reform?
So we have been doing an amazing job at Katal Center. We've been flying, we've been holding these rallies, we've been hosting these community sessions, these input sessions, these town halls. We've been really at the forefront of informing people, the general population, of what these individuals go through. Because you are going to know, especially in the Black community, because as earlier, spoke about earlier, there are racial disparities, right? Black people are 12 times more likely to be incarcerated for these violations than a person not of color, a white person. So you are going to know, like a lot of people in our community or in the Black community, that will know someone that's on parole, but they don't know the actual like details behind it. They don't know exactly what we go through. You don't know like the fear. They don't know like the trauma this causes to not only the individual on parole, but also their family.
Right. And you talked about that, not just the individual, but the family. What's it like for, if you don't mind being personal, your family, knowing that, you walk around daily and there's this potential that, hey, you can go to the store and something could happen. And then all of a sudden, before you know it, you're right back where you came from. So
I like to say that it's not only me on parole and my family is on parole, because I live with my family, and at any given time in the past, the parole officer could come in and say, hey, like, we need to express things. We need to see what's going on. So you put my family, my elderly parents, at a risk for coronavirus, COVID, right? It's time of COVID, they got to come in, they got to check things out. And you're talking about elderly people, unvaccinated at a time, that may be exposed to someone going around to multiple different houses, exposed to multiple different situations. My family could be exposed to something like that. Also, my children, there's been numerous times where my son, he has football practice, he has a football game, and he's like, Daddy, can you come? And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to try to be there. And he's like, try? What do you mean try? I'm like, well, I have to get the approval from my parole officer. And there's many times where, because of another thing I like to talk about, because of their workload, their caseload, there's so many people on parole that he hasn't got back to me. I've missed important dates. I've missed important sessions with my family, my sons, my daughter. It's just, there needs to be a complete revamp of the system. And that's why less is more is so important. We're changing the way how the system works. We're changing the way how things work to make it fair and balanced for everyone, for people on parole. And these are good people. I'm not a bad person. This is someone who was remember, like I said, wrongfully incarcerated for a crime that was deemed dismissed in the interest of justice. So not everyone you see is bad, but we have this just like a bad connotation or a bad we're contextualized in this box that everyone on parole is a criminal or a bad person or they're gonna go do something. No. These are good people that just wants to be there for their family, their community, and make an impact on the people's lives that touch them.
Right. I think you touched upon something a little earlier that I want to expound upon, and that's the whole issue of due process, right? Because you can be in that process. You talked about parole officers being overloaded, that you can't even get to a place where I get a response back. So what's it like, and what would you like to see in the area of due process for those on parole? So
that's the main component of less is more, bolstering due process. The Less is More Act, when Governor Cuomo signs this into law, provides for speedy hearings, all right? People who are detained, right? If they're detained, their hearings are required to be completed within 35 days. And for people who are at liberty, because remember, this law, some people will be at liberty. They won't be automatically incarcerated. So people at liberty, those hearings must be completed within 55 days, which is a huge contrast to right now, the 105 days. Like you said, the person had known, he spent months in jail only to find out, hey, I didn't do anything wrong and now I can go back after he lost his job, his housing, and his family. So there are other things though, but like with due process. So right now, with this law, all hearings would be required to be held in the community instead of being held inside jails. That does massive things for the psychology behind people going in front of these boards for this hearing, right? It improves transparency, and it allows for witnesses and loved ones and the general public to access and be a part of these hearings because we can see. It brings about transparency, which is what we need in this whole parole system. And it establishes the right to counsel. Now we have proper representation that we weren't having before. Now we have a lawyer, an attorney present that we didn't have the ability to have before. It just really makes things a lot more fair for everybody.
Yeah. Well, less is more is definitely out there. Hopefully the governor will have an opportunity to sign it and sign it soon. I know it would do well for parolees. I know it would do well for their families. And I think overall, it would do something in the area of communities of color where so many people have been impacted. Talk to me about that. When you see that number of so many of communities of color right behind bars, right on parole, for you, a person of color, what's that feeling like for you?
You know, it's you feel as if you're targeted. People of color have been targeted. We are targeted, and it's disheartening to know that as an individual, as a man, a Black man, that at any given time your life could be taken away from you, your livelihood, your job, your family could all be taken away from you. So it's very disheartening at that level.
Yeah. And so the Katal Center has been at the forefront of really making the voice heard. Talk to me about your work.
So yeah, so like I mentioned before, our work has been community involvement, informing the community, educating the community about people on parole, about parole reform, educating the communities about other states providing parole reform. You know, it's not just New York State that is on the forefront of parole reform. We have whopping legislation that we want to get signed, but there's been other states, Arizona comes to mind, that has been, working on parole reform.
Yeah. So for people who want to get connected to you guys and really support the work that you're doing, how can they be a voice and how can they be an advocate, given the fact that this is a major issue that needs to be dealt with?
So yeah, there's something we could do. You can visit actually www.lessismoreny.org. That's LESSISMORENY.org. And you can take the online action tool where you can contact Governor Cuomo and urge him to sign the bill, because that is really what we need. We need to urge him and let him know, like, look, we want you to sign this bill and we want you to actually implement it at an earlier date so that people on parole can have that incentive, that 30-day incentive to remember, 30-day incentive is every 30 days a person's on parole, they will actually get 30-day credit. So essentially their parole time will be cut in half.
Mm-hmm. And that's major, and that's huge. What has it been like with elected officials? I mean, are they really supportive right now? How's it been with them?
Yeah, we have had support from district attorneys, Republican district attorneys, the legislature, the Senate. This bill wouldn't have gotten passed if we didn't have support. If the people, the politicians, didn't feel as if they owed their constituents to pass this bill, because that's what they want. You know, they support it, right? So this bill wouldn't have gotten passed if the people didn't demand it, and people are demanding. People are feeling the fear. People are feeling the disheartening terror that comes along with a person being on parole and their loved ones and their families and disrupting the communities. So yes, we have a lot of support.
Oh yeah, and I apologize. I didn't frame it right probably when I said about the support, because we do know it takes support in order for the bill to pass, right? But then when we're talking about where we are in this moment with, you're just on the brink of this thing could happen if the governor signs it, really keeping the governor at bay. I know he's got a lot of things to worry about right now, but yet and still really keeping him keeping his feet to the fire and making sure that the signature occurs.
Yeah, and that's a fact. Yeah, we want to urge Governor Cuomo. We want to let him know, like I support you, Governor Cuomo, to sign this bill, because it's going to impact people of New York. It's going to impact people on parole, people that need that freedom or that fair treatment in the parole justice system, criminal justice system with parole.
Yeah, and so for you, as we're talking about, your experience and going through it, what would you finally just want somebody to know before we close out?
I want people to know that we are advocating for technical parole violations that people can be reincarcerated for something as small as missing an appointment with your officer, something as small as missing curfew, something as small as being in the same room or knowing someone that is on parole or has a criminal background, right? So I just want people to know that this bill is advocating for technical parole reform for violations, things that could turn someone's life.
Well, Avion, I want to thank you for being with us here on the Social Justice Forum. Certainly, I think that it's important that we continue to keep this conversation flowing, and we'll continue to track and see as things get closer if the governor does sign it and the many thousands of people that it will impact just by the stroke of a pen. So thank you so much for being a great voice and sharing your story with us too, and really bringing it home.
Pleasure to be here.
All righty. Well, definitely want to let you know that you can find out more. Go to the Katal Center for Equity, Health, and Justice, and you can find out more. We've also want to let you know that we're at the end of our show. And so we hope that you enjoyed this week's discussion on the Bronx Social Justice Forums. But now if you want to rewatch this week's episode, of course, catch the cable cast again on BronxNet TV or BronxNet.org. And remember, you can always share your points of view on any of our social media platforms, and we'll continue to elevate the conversation and bring awareness next week. Until then, I'm Daren Jaime saying take care and God bless.